Hi there, my name's Tom Freer, and today I want to talk about penetration testing and vulnerability scanning and what that means and what it is in relation to your cybersecurity strategy. So if you've ever been through a compliance process such as ISO, there's a good chance that you've been advised that you need to run a penetration test. So what is this? So a penetration test is an activity that is designed to identify vulnerabilities that might exist on your network, and predominantly from an external facing perspective. So we organise resources and systems to perform let's say an attack that could happen against your firewall. Now, if you're hosting services, maybe web services or client portals or remote access and VPN, this will have open ports that are available to the wider internet that people can connect to get into your system. So if we look at VPN or remote desktop style services, traditionally they're used for your staff, but we don't know where your staff are necessarily connecting from, so that access is made available all the time from any location. So a user can connect to their Wi-Fi at home or their hotspot on their mobile or the internet cafe or in their hotel, which then has the ability for them to connect to the VPN to head into your network, and away they go. However, if that VPN service, that remote desktop service, that website that they log into in your network has a vulnerability in it, then that opens up for an attacker to be able to use that to potentially get into your network as well. So this is where an external penetration test comes in. What it does is it looks at the external network addresses on your system, and it tries to find anything that's open that it could use to get into your network, and then uses lots of known standards and known techniques and known vulnerabilities to try and crack access to get in. So for example, it might be that you have a website that is hosted on your network, might be a client portal or something like that, and you have it hosted on your network, and there would be a firewall in front of that, and there would be some open access on there that the general public can use to get access to the web page and then log in. Now, a vulnerability scan or a penetration test, which does a vulnerability scan, will find that open website, it will look at it, and then it will run a series of tests against it to see if there are any known vulnerabilities or known ways to compromise that website. For example, there might be a vulnerability in the way that users log into that site, and being able to run a specific test across that would be beneficial. It might be that the web server that it's running on has an old operating system that hasn't been patched, and because of that there is a known vulnerability that could be compromised by an attacker. So running this external penetration test will identify that and allow you the opportunity to then go and rectify. Now, this is really, really important from a security and compliance perspective, because if that is left unchecked, the chances of someone finding that and then using that to get into your network are very, very high. Now, it might not be that you're being specifically targeted by cyber criminals, but the reality is there are people and organisations sitting on the web constantly browsing, constantly scanning and looking for these vulnerabilities and looking for opportunities to go and compromise an organisation. We've seen it in the past where organisations may be hosting remote desktop services and using an older version or an unpatched version. It's just there, it's been there forever. One day though, someone finds that on the internet, executes a malicious tool against it to gain access to your system, and then suddenly you've been crypto locked and all your data has been locked away and compromised, and now you're being asked for a ransom. Now, that was because there was a server that was sitting open to the internet that was running an unpatched operating system that had a known vulnerability, and someone has just found that and decided to compromise it. They weren't specifically looking for you, they weren't specifically targeting you, they were scanning the internet, scanning every IP address and looking for these opportunities. And that's why it's really important to be running these penetration tests and vulnerability scans on at least an annual basis, so you know what's there, what exists, what potential risks are there, and if there are opportunities to mitigate those risks with patching and updates, then that's what needs to happen. What else you find is that sometimes legacy systems haven't been decommissioned properly, or they may still be sitting there because we were using it for a period but hadn't quite turned it off. A vulnerability scan on that external and that penetration on those external addresses will identify those and give you that reminder to, do we still need this system and should we be turning it off? So from a compliance perspective, it's really important that these are run at least annually. That goes a long way to adding to that evidence around ISO certification. You'll also find that some third-party providers may request that type of information when you're going for contracts or renewals and things like that. So it's important to have this available. Now, should you be running it more than annually? That really comes down to what is happening in your environment and in your business. If you know that there's not much change, it's the same systems, it's the same access points, then an annual scan is more than sufficient. Go through, run the scan, make sure there's been no changes, no new security flaws or incidents found that could be used. So annual's fine. However, if your business, you are doing new updates, deploying new systems, migrating to new servers, then you need to be doing this more regularly. And it might be part of your change control process. Okay, we're deploying a new web server today. We know that it sits here. Right, we now need to run a new penetration test on that particular server or service to make sure it's okay. You may be doing regular updates to software, regular updates to whatever it is, regular updates that should then be checked to make sure that there's nothing new being introduced that could be compromised. So that's from an external perspective looking in. It's taking a look at from that anonymous aspect. I've found this system on the internet. What potentially could be compromised in there? We then look at penetration testing and vulnerability scanning on the internal side. So this is the side where your users turn up every day and they plug their computers into the network. Now, you might be thinking, well, what could potentially be compromised here? Surely someone is not going to be able to walk in and plug into my network and run a scan and find these vulnerabilities and compromise them. You'd be surprised. It can happen. Where's your wireless advertised to? Is your wireless protected? Those sort of things. So there's things you need to consider around how your wireless networks are set up, where they're visible to, how they're authenticated to. So there is a risk there. Again, this is probably more targeted approach. If someone really wants to get in, they're going to find a way from that side of it. So doesn't mean you should not be doing these vulnerability scans internally, because the other aspect of it is that if for some reason a user's computer is compromised, so they may have inadvertently gone to a dodgy website and downloaded a file or an executable that's now running on that machine, and depending on the technologies you have in place, standard antivirus software may not have detected it. So that could then be used to take advantage of vulnerabilities that exist on the internal network to spread and go and cause havoc. So that side of it is where you need to get that visibility around what is happening internally in your network. What vulnerabilities exist, what devices are connected to your network. Do you know all the devices? How many of the TVs that are in your organisation have vulnerabilities on them? I don't know. What other IP or network related devices have people just plugged in? Printers, they're essentially computers these days. So have they been secured? Have they been updated? Are there any known vulnerabilities in this? Now, it might not be a specific manufacturer or a specific device, but a lot of these devices on the network run very common services. FTP, Telnet, web services, all these sort of services are generic and all potentially could have vulnerabilities in them. Now, if you don't know they're there or what the effect of that vulnerability is, then there's a risk to the organisation. So at the very least, it's knowing what exists and what needs to be locked down. I guess one other important aspect to all this is it's really good to run these scans. Now, again, internally, how often should you run them? Probably more than you would externally. So you might run these every quarter, just so you know what's happening and changing, and what needs to be addressed across the network, because identifying is one aspect of it, but then you've actually got to go through the process of remediation. And in saying that, you don't have to remediate every risk that exists if you know it's there, and if you understand what that risk is and what the chances or the effect or the impact of that being compromised, then there are certainly times where you don't need to mitigate. There are as long as you know they're there, you know what the risks are, then you may not need to mitigate all those risks. However, if you're running these, at least quarterly, then you can sort of start to understand where do we need to focus our efforts, because effort comes with cost. Effort comes with impact to users around implementing and changing these security controls. So internally, we would probably suggest quarterly or at least twice a year to go through and identify what's there, look at the list, work through what is high impact, what's critical, what does need to be mitigated, what doesn't, and then use that as a reference point. So when we look at doing these things, traditionally they have been quite a complex and an intensive process to go through, which is why they've always been really quite expensive to run. I guess as technology improves and as systems improve, we've been able to identify ways and solutions that allow our team to help our clients identify these risks in a much more cost-effective and streamlined manner, so they can effectively be run more often in the organisation. Now, it doesn't mean we need to run them weekly or monthly, because just because we're identifying something every month doesn't mean we've got time, budget to rectify it every month. So we don't have to run them more regularly to that point, but it does allow us to run them in a way that we can implement change, rerun to make sure that change has actually gone through and done it effectively. So that's where the technology is today, and the tools and the processes that have been put together allow us to go through and help our clients do this on a more regular basis. And to that point, from a testing perspective, we see some of the frameworks and some recommendations saying that these things need to be run on a weekly basis. Well, again, you can run them weekly, but are you actually going to be able to implement any of the requirements within the next week to rectify that? So it's getting that balance right. It's looking at ways and looking at what needs to be assessed at what point in time as well. So just because we can doesn't mean we should run them on such a regular basis, but the ability to run them more than once a year or more than once every 2 years, or at least run them when you've never run them before, is going to give you a much better insight into what's going on in the organisation and in your network and your infrastructure, and then give you much more comfort around what the risks are and what needs to be done to rectify those risks. So that's penetration testing and vulnerability scanning. So hopefully that's given you some better insight into what these are, what they do, and how you can use them to better protect your business and operations.